Managing a world of sports.
Most of what goes on in sport goes on off the playing field.
It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
Sport plays an important international role in the life of nations. The Olympic Games, the World Cup in soccer, Ryder Cup in golf are examples of international competitions which bring athletes together to compete for national pride and personal honor. International sports has been used in diplomacy to sanction nations. Teams or athletes from targeted nations have been banned from international competition as one means to put pressure on nations to make changes. International sports also has been used to create mutual understanding among nations. International games have been arranged to bring together people in peaceful sports settings who have been separated by politics or war. International sports organizations have significant influence over the rules and operations of national organizations in sport. When international sports associations, such as the International Olympic Committee, are accused of ethical violations such as bribery or favoritism, these scandals can result in harm to the sport. What are some of the ethics and management issues in international sports? We discussed international sports at the Summit, the first international conference on ethics in sport. Let's revisit the Summit and join in on the discussion.
The International Olympic Committee have the moral right to control the moral authority in a sport at a time when it could be argued that they had abdicated that authority by putting perks and prestige and power and, as somebody called, the blazerati that walks around in front of the interests of the athlete time and time again. So I'm wondering, guys, if you see that the moral dilemma or the ethical dilemma of having to listen to an organization which has really at its base the athlete's interest not at heart.
It drives everybody crazy, is what it does. I mean, I talk from the Canadian perspective. The Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport has done, they're among other things, they do doping control in Canada, and frequently get the calls, right? The IOC has just said this. Well, can you explain that? No, I'm sorry. I think what's happened is that the IOC has got an enormous amount of power. It is very jealous of its public image. It wants to be seen to do, we'll call it the right thing, but what is defined as the right thing is going to be very much rooted in public perception.
Or self-interest.
Yes, because the public perception will guide what counts as self-interest.
I think money plays a big role. The IOC is a big franchise. They want to make the sport clean for people watching at home, for the bettors, for people that are making it worth the value that it is to the current owners. And so I hate to be cynical, but I think money in the Olympic franchise and certainly the NFL and certainly other professional organizations.
Yeah, if I might add, the IOC is not my area of expertise, although I actually did turn down a chance to try out for the Olympic basketball team. So I guess I could say I was an Olympic athlete. I would have made it. But the thing to remember about the IOC is one simple thing. Who owned all the land at Nagano? The Japanese representative of the IOC. The taxpayers paid to build all this jet train out to his new lodge that was built by the Olympics. And that's how the Olympics work. It's all money.
So what about moon bikes in the '84 Olympics when American cyclists who weren't fancied to win medals suddenly came through with a whole bunch of medals, and Raleigh, the makers of the bike, later marketed the bike under the slogan of the unfair advantage. You know that. Now then, Ought we to take the medals away from those people because only those societies which have access to space-age technology and metals construction and ballistics and whatever it is that the scientists have to know about in order to produce these darn things, should we take the medals away from them because this was an advantage? And was it an unfair advantage? Well, I don't know. You know, if all cyclists didn't have access to these facilities, then perhaps the advantage was unfair. So, but nobody says that. And my conclusion from it, people don't normally care about unfair advantages. They don't give a damn. You know, I had a friend came back from Chad after a visit with Olympic Solidarity, taking some coaching materials down there. He came back and he said the whole country of Chad, this is some years ago now, 10, 15 years ago, the whole country of Chad has worse sporting facilities than the average American high school. Now then, we have international athletic competitions where athletes from Chad are pitched against athletes from the... Is this fair? Or do Americans have an unfair advantage? Nobody bothers with this question. In fact, whole societies present sporting competition as evidence of the superiority of their societies.
I didn't realize the rest of the world didn't allow women to do sport and to compete. And the Korean women, for the first time ever, sent a crew to the Olympics. And they didn't speak a lot of English. We had to ride 2 hours on the bus to the site for the rowing site. We stayed at Santa Barbara campus, and then we rode for 2 hours to Lake Casitas. And as soon as you get off the bus, right, everyone's got to go to the washroom. This is the first thing, right? You got all these athletes sitting on the bus for 2 hours, straight to the washroom. So there's all these porta potties set up. And on our bus were the Korean women and ourselves and a lot of the Latin American or Latin men's teams, scullers and sweepers, both. And we got off the bus, and the Korean women got off first, and they went to the front line of these porta potties to use the washrooms. And I remember the Latin sculler walking. He walked right by. He walked right by the Korean women, went to the front of the line to go in first. And I couldn't believe this guy. He didn't think they should be there. He didn't even recognize what would have been chivalry in some countries, but that was not even, they didn't even exist. He went to the front of the line. And when he went into the porta potty, I tried desperately to get those Korean women to help me push it over. I could not stand it. And I couldn't speak English, and they couldn't speak English, and they couldn't understand why I was so upset that this guy had done this.
Why not have a competition over a 4-year period between countries, between sports scientists, to produce the best, cheapest javelin? And then the IOC is very rich, you know, it can just distribute javelins all over Africa and all over Asia and so on. Make them out of plastic. But make a plastic javelin that's beautifully balanced and goes nicely through the air, but isn't so good that it'll kill the audience. I mean, they were throwing them out of the stadiums, weren't they? Right, so produce the best javelin, which will produce the best event and which everybody can have a go with. And then, on the day of the event, you produce 6 or 8 or 12 javelins, and any competitor can choose any one of those javelins, but he can't bring his own javelin to throw, right? Now, does that produce fairness and equality in competition? Yes, it does. Would it be easy and cheap to do? Yes, it would. Why don't we do it? We don't do it because people don't care about the unfair advantage. So that's the kind of interest I have in ethical argument within sport. I do believe that sport can be made more ethical, especially international sport, can be made more ethical very cheaply and very easily, but we don't trouble to do it.
Craziest thing in the world. I mean, soccer is the most popular game in the world, and people in America don't give it. You know, and vice versa. You know, but the cultural machinery of America is such that it can saturate the rest of the world and influence the rest of the world in some ways as to thinking significant American sports when America has not really done the same in response. But that's changing because you have, you know, soccer is like the top game now amongst young kids. And, you know, increasing population of Latinos and, you know, where soccer is very big and cultures they're coming from. And, oh, it's amazing, you know. So who knows, man, 50 years from now, be watching like the World Cup like it's the Super Bowl. That could happen, you know, globalization. And
I think we should start a National Sportsmanship Day, and I think we should set as an objective, as really the only objective at the outset, to create dialogue with the hope that by creating dialogue, good things will result. It's the old Voltaire precept that no problem can stand the assault of sustained thinking. That's what we wanted to try to do with National Sportsmanship Day, and as many of you may or may not know, or some of you may not know, the day has become a significant event in our country and indeed in other countries. We celebrated the day last year in 101 countries and in approximately 11,000 schools.
What I tried to do, the International Olympic Committee just put out a new encyclopedia on sport medicine, and they asked for a chapter on ethical issues for women in sport in this volume. So what I tried to focus on is that all of sport medicine treats women as ill because they're not men and they don't have men's bodies.
International sports can play a significant role for the good of humanity and can clearly display human shortcomings when bad choices are made. While conflicts of interest are not uncommon in organizations where decisions affect millions and millions of dollars of investment, many trust our prestigious international sports organizations to operate at a higher standard of excellence. Armen Keteyian, two-time Emmy Award-winning sports writer, CBS and HBO sports correspondent, says that the International Olympic Committee does not act in the interests of the athletes and as a result should not have the moral authority to control international sports. Dr. Robert Butcher, a sports ethics consultant to the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, notes that the IOC decisions and actions defy easy ethical explanation. The IOC is a powerful organization that does what is necessary to present a good image to the public. Dr. Huizinga, author of You're Okay, It's Just a Bruise, and past president of the NFL Physician Society, and Pete Gent, former Dallas Cowboy football player and author of North Dallas 40, claim that the IOC, like the NFL, is a big business and that it is money that drives the decisions of the IOC. Pete Gent believes that the Japanese IOC representative owned the land in Nagano where the Olympics were held. These financial rewards provide significant conflicts of interest and raise significant ethical issues regarding IOC management. Dr. Angela Schneider, Canadian silver medalist in rowing at the 1984 Olympic Games and associate professor at the University of Western Ontario, emphasizes that different values held in different societies results in conflicts at international competitions. Those who do not share your values often show their dislike for you. She believes that many ethical problems result from differences in concept of what constitutes the ideal athlete. Dr. Todd Boyd, author of Out of Bounds, Sports, Media, and the Politics of Identity, and professor at the University of Southern California, argues that international sports is about marketing, fame, and money, and that sports is not about playing ball anymore. Dan Doyle is the founder and executive director of the Institute for International Sport at the University of Rhode Island, and he reports that International Sportsmanship Day is spreading to many countries around the globe, and that this international celebration of sport can help counteract negative global realities in the world. Sport can draw attention to locations and causes worldwide, and as a result, it has significant power to influence public opinion. How should we understand the role of international sport in society? What place does sport have in history and international society?
Well, I can tell you that President Mandela, as well as most South Africans, felt that it was the sports boycott that was the most important of all the actions against South Africa. When he was on Robben Island, they would read and hear about the people protesting around the world against sports matches with South Africa, and it was the first time they understood that the world community was starting to understand how racist and evil a system of government the apartheid regime had. And when he was inaugurated, and I was lucky enough to be one of the 200 people that he personally invited to the inauguration because of my work in the anti-apartheid movement, he decided not to go to any of the more than 100 diplomatic parties that were being held in Pretoria, but instead got in a helicopter and went to the Zambia-South African soccer match, where I was lucky enough to sit with him for several hours and talk about his understanding of the world of sport as it could bring people together. And basketball is the sport that he has chosen, a sport that was not played very much in South Africa. Where it was played, it was by whites. It's now the most rapidly growing sport in South Africa, and it's the only sport that blacks and whites play together. So basketball is going to have a special significance in the South African history.
It's not uncommon for many of us who, for example, watch the Olympic Games and who have intellectual interest in sports to dismiss the games as a sort of chauvinist display with the flags and the like. But many of us find ourselves in a very strange situation of watching a triumphant athlete standing on the podium and the national anthem being played, and tears trickling down our eyes. What's going on? What exactly is that about? And sports are some of the most important and, again, vivid displays of nationalism and national identity. If you look at the Olympics, an international festival of incredible proportion in which the idea is to mix different nations and members of different cultures and learn, in some sense, from one another about our respective ways of life. And again, here I think there's a moral force of nationalism as well, in a sense in which it's not about superiority, it's about making one's culture the best one can, which involves respecting other cultures and respecting enough about them to notice things that they do that might be, in fact, improvements in the way in which we live our lives.
We've brought Project Teamwork, which is our program that teaches young people about race relations and conflict resolution, to South Africa, to Italy, where they have an enormous gang problem now, and to Northern Ireland in Belfast, where we brought young people together from both parts of Ireland to try and use sport as a vehicle to bring them together to see some of these things. And of course, my own roots in the world of sport are very much in the international area. Well, it started very accidentally in some ways. I was very interested in South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement, and because of my own life in the world of sport and because of my father being considered to be a pioneer on the racial issue in sport, I eventually became the national chairperson of the coalition of groups that came together to boycott South African sport for more than 2 decades, and now a relationship with President Mandela and the ANC to try and develop sports in South Africa as a way to integrate the most segregated society in the history of the second half of the 20th century.
Well, interestingly enough, we have African nations participating in Western sports, many of which those sports were loaded with values which suggested that only Americans and Europeans could do well at them. And what do we find? We find Africans beating Westerners at their own games. 2 things happen from that. Number one, a sense of self-esteem and self-respect that is not available to Africans in virtually any other avenue. The second thing we learned from that is to dispel any racial and national stereotypes we might have held. They're being thrashed in front of us, as it were. My own view is there is an important moral ideal about not just tolerating other cultures, but respecting them. And the difference between tolerance and respect is tolerance implies that you can live your life and I will let you live your life the way you like. But it doesn't imply I respect what you do or I will attempt to learn anything from you and change my own behavior. Respect requires that we know something about your culture and about your forms of life. And it also implies that if we learn something that we find valuable, we can in fact use it in our own culture.
Well, when we went to Italy, it was in Rome, and the Italian government, which was starting to experience gang violence for the first time, brought gang members from the United States, South Africa, and Italy there, all people who had interest in arts, culture, or sports, all young people who had said that they want to get out of the gang life, but to use their artistry or sportsmanship to help other people get out, help create a different life potential for young people who live in so much despair in communities across the globe. And although the sessions were unbelievably disorganized and chaotic, the fact that these young people were together, being able to share their own experiences, their own lives, passion for arts, music, culture, and sports as ways to bring people together it was very powerful and very moving. And all those young people, to give you an example of what the potential was, 4 of the 60 people invited were killed in the week before the conference in gang violence. They are all now leaders in movements for peace in their own communities since they've gone back home after the conference.
In soccer, for example, where there's quite a lot of argy-bargy, and occasional violence breaks out and so on, but people are excluded and are not allowed to be replaced. Now, in a basketball match, for example, you can foul around the place as much as you like. It doesn't matter. You go off, some other guy comes on, fouls around the place, and he goes off, another guy comes on. So it's quite simple to make rule changes that will get rid of this kind of behaviour. Or if it doesn't get rid of the behaviour, then the team remains severely disadvantaged for the rest of the game. So the point that kept crossing my mind during the conference was, well, if people really dislike this kind of thing so much, why don't they simply change the rules? And they don't. The rules do not get changed. Now, that's the interesting feature. Why don't the rules get changed? And the answer is, of course, has to be, doesn't it, that there are vested interests which require this kind of notoriety, this kind of activity surrounding the game, hype, newsworthiness, whatever it is, in order to sell tickets or market the game or whatever it is. So it's a matter really of social pressures and economic pressures working on the game. But from my point of view, it would not be difficult in terms of the rules of the game to eradicate this kind of behavior.
Sports are an important metaphor for human life, and morally and politically they provide some of the most powerful images of who we are as people. And what better way to explore and interpret and criticize and mine human values, both human values within cultures and across cultures, and larger conceptions again of who we claim to be and what we want our sports to stand for.
My dream is that I won't have a job. There was a time in the 1980s when I was with the man who was the architect of the anti-apartheid movement in this country. His name was George Hauser. And we were talking, and he was reflecting the thought that he never thought he would live to see a free South Africa, and that our dream really was that there would be no need for an anti-apartheid movement anymore because South Africa would be free. And we both lived to attend that inauguration and to know that's the case. My ultimate dream for America is that Native American people, who I consider to be our most spiritual people, believe that all the people of the world live within that one circle of humanity, irrespective of what they look like. That Americans will come to understand that that's reality. And I also know that when I say that to audiences, as I frequently do, no matter how impactful I have been on them and I've become a reasonably good speaker, I could see eyes glaze over and people say, man, this guy's really lost it. What is he thinking about? And I come back to the fact that nobody could have believed that Nelson Mandela would have been president of South Africa in the 60s and 70s, but I had that vision in the back of my mind that someday I might live to see that. And as I said earlier, that if he could become president, that anything and everything is possible, including us all living within that one circle of humanity.
The values, rights, and responsibilities associated with sport in the international setting provide guidance for management organizations who are called upon to make decisions regarding athletes, teams, nations, or international team behaviors or health and training practices. Jim Perry, founding director of the British Olympic Academy and head of the School of Philosophy at the University of Leeds in England, maintains that while some say there are too many rules, he believes that a few more could improve safety and fairness in international sport. He believes that vested economic and social interests maintain the status quo, which results in harm to many athletes. Dr. Bill Morgan, author of Leftist Theories of Sport and editor of the Journal of the Philosophy of Sport, sees the Olympics as international festivals where international sports competition and success enhances national pride. He believes that international competition can develop national self-esteem and dispel negative national stereotypes, and that sports are an important metaphor for human life, and sport provides powerful images of who we are. Dr. Richard Lapchick, recipient of many prestigious international humanitarian awards, founder and director of Northeastern University's Center for the Study of Sport in Society, and noted author, reported on Project Teamwork, which teaches kids around the world about race relations. He is actively involved in using sports to integrate South Africa. He recalls that Nelson Mandela thought it was the sports boycott that was the most influential foreign action taken against apartheid. He believes that if Nelson Mandela can rise from prisoner to president of South Africa, then anything is possible, including the people of the world living together in peace. International sports provides a window on the nations of the world. We see their commitments, or lack thereof, to the core values, rights, and responsibilities of sport. The power of sport to address the issue of apartheid in South Africa and the use of sport to address racial and ethnic prejudice around the world makes sport one of the few human practices capable of making bridges between cultures. The power of sport to provide a foundation for international marketing and the use of this marketing power in recent forays by sports leagues into nations throughout the world shows that sports is a growing influence and presence in our modern culture. Sports seems destined to become an even larger influence on the international scene in the days to come.